In early November of 1965, the Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki gave a talk on the beginner's mind, and it's become, since then, a classic of Buddhist practice, of Buddhist approach to practice, of coming at practice with the beginner's mind. So what I want to do in today's video is to discuss that and some of its history and ramifications. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. What I want to discuss today, as I say, is the beginner's mind. What we want to get into is its history, because actually, although the teaching seems and is indeed relatively straightforward and simple in many ways, it comes from a deep history of Buddhist thought, of Buddhist thinking and philosophy. And we want to tease that out. And in many ways also, the teaching goes against some more early ideas of Buddhist practice. And so what I want to do towards the end of today's video is to get into that. So basically what we're going to be doing here is, first I'll outline what the beginner's mind is, the beginner's mind approach to our practice is, then looking at some of its history, where it comes from, where the ideas of it come from, then how it differed in many, in fact, radical ways from earlier Buddhist teachings. And then at the end of today's video, I'll try to see if we can reconcile all of this and bring it together. So first, what is Shunryu Suzuki's beginner's mind teaching? This is the idea that when we oftentimes do practice, we do it based on rote. We learn a formula, and we go over that same formula many, many times, and it becomes something that we do on autopilot, something that we do without thinking, without real reflection, without real energy. The difference is that the beginner comes at practice with a completely open mind. The beginner doesn't know what to expect. The beginner doesn't have things written out in front of them because they're just starting. They really don't know what they're supposed to be doing. And as a result, the beginner brings a kind of an energy to their practice. They bring a kind of openness to their practice, which we can sometimes get away from later on as we become more familiar with what we're practicing, with what we're doing. In fact, it's a familiarity with all of life that we tend to lose as we grow older. As Suzuki very famously said at the beginning of the book, in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind there are few. To Suzuki, this implies that the beginner's mind is open in a way that the expert's mind is not. The beginner's mind is, in a sense, truly in the moment. They're truly seeing everything that's in front of them because no possibilities are being ruled out. At least not immediately, because they don't know what to rule out. They're just coming to whatever they experience for the first time, as it were. Whereas the expert, so to speak, is somebody who perhaps doesn't completely find themselves in the moment. Instead, the expert is relying on their memory, on their understanding of the world, on things that aren't here and now, but are instead things that come from their own recollections. And in that sense, the expert is perhaps not seeing all the possibilities. There are only few possibilities. So this approach defines the sort of beginner's mind practice. Now, secondly, what I want to do is to get into a little bit of the history behind this idea of the beginner's mind. If we know something about Zen, we'll know that one of the main, I would say the main focus of Zen is on a particular problem that they see, that the Zen approach sees to our interaction with the world. In particular, we have a problem in our conceptualization of the world, in our attempt to rationally understand everything that surrounds us through ideas, concepts, viewpoints, beliefs. All of these, from a Zen perspective, are fatally flawed. They're all completely beside the point. They're getting us away from a more we might say, natural, a more effortless way of interacting with the world, with the present moment. Our concepts, our learning, even we might say our enculturation, the way that we are integrated into our present culture, are all ways that cover over what we might term our original mind. And that indeed what is termed in certain schools of Buddhism the original mind, the mind that we were, that sort of underlies all of our experience, that original mind that is covered up by this learning, by this enculturation, is something that we want to try to get back to when we're trying to get back to a more natural way of living in the world. And to this end, Suzuki says that the best way towards perfect composure is to forget everything, by which he means that we have to, in a sense, forget all of our enculturation. We have to, in a sense, forget all of our concepts and ideas and viewpoints. We have to forget our tendency to rationally understand everything. Now, this idea of an original mind to which we should get back is something that arose, it has a historical background. It arose, in fact, in India around the 3rd century of the Common Era with a theory that's known as Tathagata Garbha, or Buddha nature. It's this idea that all of us are, in a sense, naturally, essentially, originally Buddhas, that we're all originally, naturally awakened, that our mind, in some essential sense, is already awakened, is already enlightened. And the problem that we are faced is to figure that out. We might say, if we're all already Buddhas, if we're all essentially awakened and enlightened, why do we have all these problems? Why do we have all this suffering? And the answer is because of our concepts, because of our enculturation, because of all of this deluded learning that we undergo that covers over this original true mind. In this way of looking at the Dharma, to ask us to return to our beginner's mind in our practice is essentially to ask us to find our way back to this original mind, to find our way back to this enlightened way of being in the world, to get ourselves out from under these problematic concepts and ideas and viewpoints towards something that's purer, that's more luminous and radiant. And indeed, a lot of these ideas come out of a couple of very cryptic passages in the early texts that talk about the mind being luminous in some sense, or even inherently luminous in some sense. So on that note, how is this teaching of the beginner's mind a development out of these early texts, of these ideas from the early texts? How does it differ from what we find in those early texts? And to that end, I would want us to go back to this idea that we found in Suzuki, that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, while in the expert's mind there are few. Keep that in mind when we're discussing what we're going to be discussing. There was a recent essay by Bhikkhu Thanissaro, who was a Theravadan monastic, Western monastic in the Theravada tradition. And he, as I say, has a recent essay where he discusses this kind of issue, the issue of the beginner's mind. What he says is, the Buddha doesn't tell you to view each moment with a beginner's eyes. You've got to give priority to the problem of suffering, and keep an informed understanding of the problem and its correct solution always in mind. Otherwise, inappropriate attention will get in the way. That is, what Thanissaro is saying here is that if we come at these problems with the beginner's mind, we're going to find that mind clouded by our ordinary tendencies towards greed, or towards hatred, aversion, delusion, ignorance. These kinds of ordinary tendencies that we have. And in that way, if we come at these problems with the beginner's mind, we're going to end up being diverted. We're not going to find the right answers. We're going to end up going around in circles or creating the same problems for ourselves. We might say, however, in response to that, that's because we're really not being beginners enough. That the problems that Thanissaro sees here stem from the fact that we're never really beginners when we're in our ordinary minds. So we may say, oh, I'm going to attempt to see this problem from the eyes of a beginner, but we can't really do that because we keep being pulled back by our enculturation. We keep being pulled back by our concepts. And that's the problem. The problem just keeps repeating itself. We're not really able to become beginners well enough in our practice. That what we need to do is deepen this practice of becoming a beginner until we really can get underneath everything. And to this extent, some people may say, and indeed I've heard it said, that what we really need is to attempt to enter the mind of a young child or even an infant who is existing at a time before they have concepts, before they have language. An infant doesn't have a culture, it hasn't been enculturated yet. And since it hasn't gotten to the point of having these problematic concepts. And so if we can practice in a way, at least with our intention in a way, to enter that kind of infant's mind, that will be our entrance into the idea of a true beginner's mind. There are, however, at least a couple of places in the early texts that seem to refute such a view. Now, when I say the early texts, I don't simply mean from the Theravada tradition, which is where, let's say, Bhikkhu Thanissaro is coming from, although Bhikkhu Thanissaro does have an interest, as many of these monastics do, in the early tradition for its own sake. But the sutras I'm going to be discussing exist not simply in Theravada recensions. That is to say, they don't only exist in Theravada Buddhism, but they also exist in non-Theravada Buddhism, and in fact in Chinese. So these aren't simply suttas that are only that are sectarian. They're rather property, should we say, of all of Buddhism. They're suttas that go back to the earliest traditions insofar as we can tell. One of these suttas is the Samana Mundika Sutta, and here Samana Mundika is an ascetic, a non-Buddhist ascetic, who, it's said in this sutta, has a particular theory about what the highest achievement is possible by an ascetic. He says that the highest achievement of the ascetic is not to have wrong action, not to have wrong livelihood, not to have wrong speech, not to have wrong thought. He says if an ascetic avoids all of these sorts of wrong behaviors and wrong thoughts, they've gotten to the highest realm possible by an ascetic. And one of the Buddha's disciples hears this, overhears this. He's actually listening to Samana Mundika while he's speaking. And he doesn't really know what to make of it. And so he goes back to the Buddha and asks the Buddha about this. And the Buddha says, in response, that if what Samana Mundika says is true, then a baby has the highest achievement possible by an ascetic. He says the baby doesn't have the relevant concepts. He doesn't have the concept of a livelihood. He doesn't have the concept of action, of right or wrong action. He doesn't have the concept of speech. In fact, he has no language at all, so he can't do wrong speech. He has no concepts with which to have views, so he has no views or beliefs. So the Buddha says, in this example, the baby, the infant, is somebody who displays all of what Samana Mundika is looking for. So what the Buddha says is that Samana Mundika's idea of the perfect ascetic is at the level of the infant. Whereas the Buddha says, in contrast, that the true highest ascetic is somebody who not only understands the difference between the skillful and the unskillful, the right and the wrong, if you like, but also understands the roots of skillful action and unskillful action. They understand how they're produced. They understand how they're not produced, how they're gotten away with. And they understand the route towards those things. They understand how it is that these roots are practiced, how they're actually achieved. The Buddhist says that is the true understanding of one who is truly the highest ascetic. In another early discourse called the Longer Discourse to Malunkya, the Buddha discusses the 5 lower fetters that keep us bound to the world, that keep us bound to samsara. And these are identity view, that is our view that we have a permanent self, doubt, attachment to rules and rituals, that is some belief that rules or rituals, rites and rituals are the sorts of things that can actually result in awakening, enlightenment, as well as ill will and sense desire. These are the fetters that keep us bound to the world. And in this discussion, what the Buddha says basically is that these fetters aren't simply things that we should be concerned about when they arise in the mind. They're not simply things that are a problem when they've arisen in our minds, but they're a problem even when they haven't arisen in our minds. So he says, if the only problem with these fetters was that they were literally arisen in our mind right now, then he says our doctrine would be open to refutation from our competitors, our non-Buddhist competitors, with the example of the infant. Because he says if in fact we were perfectly enlightened when the fetters weren't present, then we would be perfectly enlightened as infants. But the Buddha says infants aren't perfectly enlightened because they have these latent tendencies still within them. That is to say, the infant doesn't have concepts of views of the Dharma, so they don't have doubts. They don't have concepts of the Dharma either, which would allow them to have a fetter of clinging to rules and rituals. They don't know of any rules and rituals. They don't have ill will because they don't have the concept of other persons, of other people. They don't have concepts of sense desire, things to desire in the world, so they don't have relevant sense desire. And they don't, of course, have any concept of identity, of a self, so they don't have a self-view either. So, in that sense, the infant lacks all of these attachments, all of these fetters, but they're still latent within them. All of these fetters require concepts of some kind to get them going. The infant lacks all of these concepts, yet they still have these tendencies within them. The Buddha says, yet each underlying tendency still lies within the infant. This suggests that the problem isn't a problem of words or concepts, it's rather a problem of our underlying tendencies. And these underlying tendencies are still with us, even if the words and concepts are not. Indeed, even animals would have these underlying tendencies. That's certainly on a traditional understanding why animals are reborn, because even though they lack concepts, even though they lack language, they still have these kinds, or at least certain of the underlying tendencies. This would then suggest that returning to a beginner's mind wouldn't really solve the problem. If we return to the beginner's mind, even the most pure beginner's mind, the mind of the infant, we're still going to be in a mind that has underlying tendencies that are problematic. We're not going to be getting out from under them. And this suggests that even so far as we have an original mind of some kind, that original mind is not in fact pure. The original mind, insofar as again we have it, is a mind that's beset by problematic tendencies and that always has been. Indeed, in the traditional understanding, it's been that way for beginningless lifetimes. The notion of an original mind is also problematic for other reasons, in that it at least appears to reify the notion of a mind as something that's permanent, that's always been there and always will be there, which is an idea that's rejected in early Buddhism. Now, there are ways of understanding the original mind on which this is not true, where that original mind is a mind of emptiness, is a mind of non-self in some sort of paradoxical sense. But these are at least things to consider. Now, to return to Suzuki's quote, he says, In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. And here I think we begin to get at the heart of the difference between, let's say, an early Buddhist approach to practice and a later Buddhist Zen approach. In the early Buddhist approach to practice, the reason why the beginner sees many possibilities is because they're seeing both the skillful and the unskillful possibilities. They're not ruling anything out. They're accepting possibilities that are really not to their benefit or to other people's benefit. Whereas the wise person, we might say, the expert, is someone who has whittled down these possibilities to the ones that are truly skillful. That is to say, they have seen the difference between the skillful and the unskillful. They've seen the roots of these. They've seen the practices leading towards promoting the skillful and depromoting the unskillful. And that is why the expert sees fewer possibilities. And indeed, this is a very different framing of practice, very non-Zen, this very conceptual idea of practice. And Suzuki is aware of that. In the book, he actually says, the Buddha sometimes said, you should be like this, you ought not to be like that. But to have what he says in your mind is not so good. It's a kind of burden for you, and you may not actually feel so good. That is, this more conceptual approach to practice, where we do overtly see the difference between skillful and unskillful, can be problematic. It might not feel very good. It feels at times like it's going against what we want to do, because oftentimes we are enticed by the unskillful. We're enticed by ways of living that really aren't good for us, or aren't at least as good as we might pursue for our own benefit. So what this is all to say is that there are significant differences between a beginner's mind approach and an early Buddhist approach, ones that even Suzuki himself is aware of. And what are we to make of this? Is there a way forward? Is there a way that we can reconcile Suzuki's beginner's mind approach with our ideas of what early Buddhism tells us? I think it's important to at least consider such reconciliation, because in my view, there's a lot of benefit in the approach that Suzuki suggests. There's a lot of potential benefit in pursuing the beginner's mind. For one thing, oftentimes our practice goes stale. Oftentimes we get into a kind of a rote practice that we've done too often, or too many times, or without thinking. That we get into a kind of autopilot. If we meditate every day a certain way, a certain time, it may be the kind of thing that really isn't becoming transformative anymore. Or, in another way, some people may become very attached to views about rules, as we heard, rules and rituals, about certain ways of doing things, that certain things are right and other things are wrong, where they're paying more attention to the outside form, to the words of the rule, let's say, or to the form of the ritual, and not so much to what that rule or ritual is really supposed to be getting at. In other words, they're clinging to the form of the thing rather than trying to find the true wisdom in it and pursue the deeper wisdom. And this, I think, is a problem for many of us in our practice, where we get too up in the head, as it were. We get too rational, too cognitive in how we approach practice. This is a problem I know for myself, and I've certainly seen it in other people as well, at least that's what it seems to be from the outside. And it's a problem I think we have to consider. And in that time, Suzuki's suggestion that we come back to the beginner's mind can be an enormous boon to us in our practice. It can really help. Because at the end of the day, although concepts and learning and reasoning are all very helpful and indeed necessary on the path, they can at times become a burden. At the end of the day, when we're practicing these Buddhist things, we're not practicing in order to get an A on some kind of test. The point is not to be able to write an essay that's really, really good and that the teacher really likes. The point is not to be able to spit back a bunch of numbered lists about 8s of these and 5s of these and 2s of those. They're helpful to know about, but at the end of the day, what we're looking for is true emotional transformation, a deep personal emotional transformation that comes from letting go, that comes from stopping clinging. And that's the sort of thing that can't be done simply by thinking about it. It has to be done directly. It has to be done through personal experience. It has to be done, in a sense, with a more open beginner's mind. And so that is the kind of approach that I think even we who may be interested in, let's say, early Buddhism or a more cognitive or rational approach can find help in this. And I would hope as well on the other side, people who find great help in the Zen approach of Suzuki may also see that there is benefit to understanding the difference between skillful and unskillful as well, and bringing that into our practice too. Indeed, I'm sure that is indeed a part of Zen practice, even though Suzuki talks it down a little bit. The issue here, though, for history is that these ideas did arise from early texts that seem to claim that we have this originally luminous mind. And I did an earlier video just on this issue about the potential for an original luminous mind in the early texts. And I'll put a link to it up here on the screen if you want to check that out. Thanks so much to all of my patrons over on Patreon. If you get any use out of these videos, consider joining them and take a look. My Patreon page is linked down below. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.